third panel is entitled Crime and Punishment, and their focus is on social and cultural interpretations of sin and the context in which punishment is used. The panel will exchange ideas concerned with balancing sin and forgiveness, the effectiveness of punishment, and how punishment has changed. The panel will also explore how long one should be associated with past sin. Our moderator this afternoon is Dr. Nereida Quiles Wasserman, Director of Institutional Research, Assessment, and Compliance. Please welcome Dr. Wasserman Quiles. Ooh, I did that backwards. Dr. Quiles Wasserman.
Same thing. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. I am thrilled to be here with you today. And we have a very distinguished panel of panelists here, beginning with Reverend Dr. Michael Gerald, who is a senior pastor at Shiloh Church in New York. He is a spiritual and communal leader who emphasizes holistic ministry as an empowering religious discipline that lifts up, heals, and educates humanity. He was the undersheriff for the Mercer County Sheriff's Office and a New Jersey State Police trooper for over 14 years. He brings his former and current vocations together in his service as a member of the Westchester Correction Enforcement Officers and their families. Sorry about that. He believes strongly that law enforcement is a vocation and a call to service, and that these should be recognized. He is also a community activist and with particular interests in education and housing in Westchester County. Reverend Dr. Gerald received his doctorate in psychology of leadership from Eastern University and his Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary. Tyrone Pope is a retired law enforcement executive with over 20 years of public service in the NYPD. Presently, Mr. Pope works with the Legal Aid Society as a criminal defense investigator and as an adjunct instructor at Concordia College, teaching introduction to criminal justice and policing in diverse communities. He is currently a doctoral candidate at St. John Fisher College Education Doctorate in Executive Leadership Program that meets at the Extension site on Iona College campus. He is also an alumnus of Concordia College. He earned a Master of Business Leadership and a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration in our wonderful accelerated degree program. Katie Suss is currently a Concordia student, a junior whose major is psychology and minoring in English, and Abraham Lamboy is also a Concordia student, a sophomore whose major is psychology, minor in counseling, and served in the U.S. Army. So please help me welcome our distinguished guests. So we will begin with the Reverend's perspectives on the topic and the landscape. Then we will proceed with questions for the panel. And as Amy mentioned, we will open up the floor to your questions. So Reverend, would you please begin? Thank you.
Good afternoon. Since my career began and ended, my career began in the mid-'80s and ended in 2007 as a law enforcement professional. My career began at the height of the crack epidemic. And as you can imagine, it took many urban areas by absolute surprise. And I can tell you that from firsthand account. I graduated high school in June of 1985. I went away to Hampton University to play football in July of 1985. I came home on my first break from playing football in October of 1985. And from the time that I graduated until the time that I returned, there was a dramatic difference in my city. Now, I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, the capital of New Jersey, resident population around 80,000. And when I tell you that you could feel in the atmosphere something had shifted. And I asked, some of my friends who were still home what had happened, and they began to tell me some of the shifts that were occurring. At the same time, I had family members who also were around my age and who graduated high school with me. I think of two of my cousins who I often preach about, and people in the church community that know the stories that I tell. I talk often about Poochie and Squeaky and Nobby and Linnell and all of these fellas that Pookie and Ray Ray, all of these fellas that I invoke to make various points. But all of those individuals are my cousins. And when I returned home from school, I attended a party, and then I went to an after party. And the after party was at a local pizzeria called Nino's. And it was at that pizzeria that I discovered exactly what was going on in Trenton. I saw a late model Porsche 924 pull up. And then right behind the Porsche, I saw a Jeep Wrangler pull up, and out comes two of my infamous cousins. And I said, well, to Ricky and to Champ, I said, who hit the lottery? And they said, nobody hit the lottery. I said, how is it that you all are driving these expensive cars? And they told me what they were engaged in. I didn't quite understand at that moment what exactly they were talking about. They told me that they were whaling. Since I was a hotshot college kid, I knew that whaling had something to do with fishing. And I said, well, are you guys fishing? What are you doing? He said, no, we're not fishing, we're selling jumbos. And I said, jumbos? What in the world is a jumbo? And it was immediately after going to the pizzeria and then going to my aunt's house that I discovered the enterprise that they had enjoined. They had become very successful sidewalk pharmacologists. They were doing the prospect of selling illicit drugs to other people. And they were part and parcel of what was going on in my hometown. So, needless to say, I was both shocked but curious, because I didn't know at that time that selling drugs could get you so much money so quick. And that was very impressionable. That was a very impressionable kind of thing to discover of an 18-year-old kid who was broke in college and being hurt on the football field. Needless to say, it didn't go so well for my cousins, none of them, as many of them did an awful lot of time in prison, and as a result of their selling narcotics, and some even doing other more significant crimes than just selling drugs. And I say that to say this. 1985 is marked as the time in which the decline of the black urban community began. If you read Michelle Alexander's A New Jim Crow, she refers to that date over and over again as the mark of when the prison industrial complex began to flourish, because the hue and cry from our communities, even amongst clergy persons, was, we don't know what to do with this new sort of manifestation of crime and criminal. And the only suggestion was to lock them up. And so thus began the urge to really arrest the nuisance that had become black urban males. And so from around 1985 until very recently, the move in urban centers was to incarcerate and really over-incarcerate. 1994, the crime bill came out, 3 Strikes You're Out came out, and that just exacerbated the problems within our society. And it sort of it sort of gave rise to, you know, the awful sentences that happened as a result of urban young boys carrying small amounts of narcotics in comparison to suburban children who had more content of drugs, but weren't sentenced nearly as harshly as those who were in the urban sentence. And so it became very, very apparent that the judicial system had some degree of bias naturally built in to you know, especially the sentencing formulas. Mandatory sentencings were commonly handed out amongst urban males.
You're doing fine.
And so my work began as I was a New Jersey State Trooper. I was also on the narcotics team. I did some buy and bust operations. And I really began to have some serious conflict with the fact that, you know, we were arresting more and more young people that looked like me, who had a life much like mine. And I began to object to my superiors and ask questions about the veracity of why we are doing what we are doing, instead of going after the higher end persons who were responsible for drug trafficking. We were settling for the low hanging fruit. We were selling for those guys who were on the corner and who were making public nuisances, and, you know, who possibly were recruiting other folks to get involved in the drug trade. And so I began to work within the city of Trenton and other areas of New Jersey and work within the churches to really have a meaningful statement and a meaningful programs to pull young people away from drugs and their allure. Of course, it's hard to, you know, entice young people who can flip a brick and get, you know, $6 grand. It's hard to convince them to go to work at McDonald's and flip a burger and get, you know, $3 minimum wage per hour. And so until, in my estimation, until society really values our young people and pours into them those things that they really, really need to develop, we still will have a hard time trying to pull urban youth out of this life of crime. Of course, it's no longer you know, as prevalent as it used to be. However, there are still challenges in our urban centers where our young people are just not performing where they need to be.
You're fine.
Keep going?
If you want to.
No, I'll pass.
No, we're going to open up to questions.
Oh, okay.
But if you want to just expand on the topic of how long we should be with sin.
I'm sorry.
How long we should be associated with sin or the past.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, so that's, so I got to go to the theological realm.
Yes.
So I can just tell you that as far as one of my family members who was a kingpin drug dealer who did about 7 years in prison, and we come from you know, a working class family. And the reason I asked Ricky and Champ who hit the lottery is because all of our folks either worked in the factories or some industrial plant. So pretty much we came from a working class background. So nobody had a silver spoon in their mouths. And so it was a shock to me to discover that my cousin in 1985 was driving a Porsche. When I left for school, he had a bicycle. When I came back, he had a Porsche. You know, so the reason that I asked him about who hit the lottery is because that's how dramatic it was. And so after his arrest and after he did his sentence in prison, he discovered faith. And I believe that faith makes the difference for all of us. Until we have something viable to believe in, we can't believe in anything. And so what I discovered about Ricky was that he had qualities that no one ever really knew. And this is something that's true. When people discover a reason and a purpose for living, they tend to tap into those gifts that are given to them by what we call an almighty God. And Ricky had an unbelievable talent to do construction, and nobody even knew that. And so he began, when he came out of prison, he began to embark upon a career in construction. And to this day, he has not gone back to prison. He has not touched any drugs, and he has built an awesome company. And I tell you about another friend of mine who's the author of From the Block to the Boardroom, Tracy Syfax, who also was a drug dealer and did significant time right around the 1984, 85 era. Tracy also built a successful roofing company, and now he travels all over the world doing social justice reform. We can never write off people because they get caught in some aspect of sin. The Bible teaches us that we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. There is no one sin greater than the other sin. And when we write people off as irredeemable, we mark their lives and we mark their futures, and we sometimes cause them to withdraw from life. But everyone can make a mistake and bounce back. And so one of the reasons that I'm a staunch advocate of working with young people who have been associated with the criminal justice system is because I believe that your minor mishap, your minor mistake does not have to define your future. Currently, I serve in the Office of Children and Family Services. I go around the state and I talk to youth who are incarcerated, and I tell them the same thing that I'm saying to you right now. Just because you made a mistake, just because you're in custody, does not mean that your life has to take a tragic turn for the worse. You don't have to let this define your future. You can use this as a stepping stone, and this can become your testimony as to how you made it. Just because you have an infraction does not mean that you have to become an ultimate statistic and just withdraw from life. Thank you.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you. So we have a list of questions that will touch upon the topics of the introduction, and we will invite all panelists to speak to that. You touched on every single topic. So we'll begin with the effectiveness of punishment and how punishment has changed. The question is, to all of you, is the criminal justice system fair as it applies to various demographics, such as ethnicity, race, income, etc.? What are your thoughts regarding the high rate of incarceration for men of color? Pick either one.
So I think that there's a huge problem in aspects of poverty and people having money. So for example, many of the people who are incarcerated come from poor neighborhoods, and they're not given the opportunity of bail. That's a big issue because bail is somewhat of a luxury for people who can afford it. And so if you can't afford it, then you're automatically locked up. And the idea of that sounds like it's sort of taking away any possibility of getting out. And so I think that money is one of the biggest things. Does anyone want to elaborate on that?
I think that, like you were saying about how bail is kind of a luxury, I think that is the point, that is one of the, I mean, not the later steps, but I think just talking about, arrest rates and policing with people of color, we have to kind of think about how the system as a whole is set up to favor people of higher socioeconomic statuses, and how when people get arrested or when people commit these types of crimes, which not always are felonies or sometimes misdemeanors, think they have no other option, and how we can change the system from the start so that we can have these alternatives so that people do not have to engage in these types of things.
Thank you, Catherine.
All right.
Tom?
I'll start off. Has anybody heard of the author Michael Sandel? You ever heard of the author Michael Sandel? Michael Sandel wrote a book called Justice. what to do when you do the right thing. He asks us a question. He asks a question. Whether society is just as to ask how it distributes. He asks a question. To ask whether society is just to ask how it distributes the things we prize: income and wealth, duties and rights, powers and opportunities, office and honors. A just society distributes these goods in the right way. It gives each person his or her due. The hard questions begin when we as a people ask, what do we do and why? And that's from Sandel. And that being said, when it comes to justice reform, and it comes to criminal justice reform, and it comes to cash bail and crime and punishment, these are all public policy issues that spring from segments of society where people are disproportionately, distributed. The criminal justice system is a serious thing that we have to consider, the modification of it. I believe that when it comes to crime and punishment, some would say, you know what, that person committed the crime, he's due to what he has, but I say I believe in chances. I think every failure is a lesson in education. We learn from it. We learn from our mistakes. When it comes to bail and bail reform, just right now, recently, April 1st, 2019, New York State passed its first extensive legislative reform aiming at transforming the criminal justice system and its impact on New Yorkers. Amongst the most significant of those changes were the governing laws when it came to bail, and which will go into effect this January 1st, 2020. Now, with this, you have a cost-benefit analysis. You have to look at it. The overall scope of the criminal justice system is going to change. We're going to have positive bail reform. There's going to be equal fairness, but with that comes the pros and the cons. Later, we're going to speak on recidivism, and we're going to speak on the adverse effects of people when they are incarcerated and they are released. What do they get out of it, and do they go back? Now, you're going to have many people say, when this bail reform comes into play, which is going to be positive for people of color, because it's going to make the level playing field even, where they're not going to be susceptible to $7,000 cash bails when it comes for felonies, $5,000 cash bails when it comes for misdemeanors. Now they're going to be able to go in, and they're going to be people and organizations available to go in and tell them, listen, the judges can use their professional discretion and release people at their own will. But you're going to have law enforcement officials who are going to argue against that and say, listen, for certain crimes, for certain misdemeanors, certain felonies, certain specific crimes, where are we going to hold that threshold? I think with this new law, when you look at the penal law and the way the system is structured, we're going to have crimes committed like felony sale of narcotics, criminal burglary offenses, robbery offenses. A lot of these offenses, a lot of these felonies are going to be up for minimum cash bail. My question to you is, how do you feel about that?
Thank you, Mr. Pope. So, yes, please do.
And one of the things that I think it's good that New York is reforming the social justice system, or the criminal justice system. But one thing that we have to ensure is that we also reform policing. The top tier of the criminal justice system are the policemen and women who are engaged in the acts of apprehending and investigating crime. And as a matter of fact, so much can be done at the police level to avoid some of the most heinous sort of atrocities that happen within the criminal justice system. If police can, again, exercise what we used to do when I was a cop, something called, and I'm sure Mr. Pope when he was a cop, something called discretion. You know, if we could, you know, we are living in a time that is so unforgiving for young people. You know, everybody has body cams, everybody has all of these devices, and every cop is afraid to make a mistake, right? And so what happens? The punishment is more punitive today. When I was young, if I did something wrong, the police officer would take me home to my parents, and my parents would jack me up, right?
Yes.
Or sometimes the police would jack me up. Amen. Listen, but the fact of the matter is that police have less discretion today because of social media, because of body cams, and because of the legalities. No police officer wants to lose their job for letting little Johnny or little Susie go. And so we've taken out of policing what we used to call the station house adjustment kind of reality, where we could really resolve issues at the police level. And then what else has happened is that there's been so much sort of just racial bias injected into the police ranks, you know, so that, you know, police today are more apt to look at, you know, skin color, complexion as a determining factor. When I was in the state police, one of the landmark cases against the state police of New Jersey was racial profiling. I happened to be on the turnpike. I happened to be serving as a sergeant on the turnpike when that decision came out, and when the Justice Department came in and sanctioned the New Jersey State Police, and we could no longer do, you know, you would see people hijacked on the highway. We could no longer toss cars and get in there and find, you know, narcotics, because we were guilty of racially profiling. So there are some things that we have to attack at the police level. We have to make sure that police are given the kind of training, the kind of information that they need. And they need to have implicit bias training. They need to have, you know, sensitivity training. They need to be aware of what is going on so that your rights are not violated. And the second thing I want to say about the reforms in New York, you know, it's about time. I mean, New York was one of 3 states that did not provide discovery to defendants who were charged in the commission of a crime. And so they could not, defendants could not properly have, you know, their attorneys have discovery in time for trial. So many young people, many people in general, New Yorkers, went to jail because they didn't have proper discovery in their cases. And it's about time that that New Yorkers have made it possible that criminal justice reform is a thing.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll move on to the next topic. So this one is it's associated with past sin or choice. In some cases, maybe a choice that doesn't move your life forward. So as of 2008, over 5.3 million people in the United States were denied the right to vote because they were a convicted felon. In the national elections of 2012, the various state felony disenfranchisement laws together blocked an estimated almost 6 million felons from voting, up 1.2 million from 1976. This comprised 2.5% of the potential voters in general. The state with the highest number of disenfranchised voters was Florida, with 1.5 million disenfranchised. Between 1996 and 2008, 28 states changed their laws on felon voting rights, mostly to restore rights or to simplify the process of restoration. As of January 2019, Iowa and Kentucky are the only two states with lifetime voting bans for felons, regardless of the crime committed. My question to you, panelists, what are your thoughts on this topic? Should a convicted felon lose their right to vote in perpetuity? In other words, forever? Who would like to begin? Catherine?
Go ahead.
Katie?
I just think that it's quite just to find the patterns related to that. When you talk about the fact that convicted felons wouldn't be able to vote, you're not just talking about, this general group of people. We have to look at the patterns, which is, it's basically eliminating certain socioeconomic, certain racial groups. So we kind of have to, I think, look at the deeper meanings and deeper divisions behind this type of voting, where it's, in a sense, changing the outcomes of the votes, and lots of proportions of groups would be voting, and it kind of just changes the outcome.
Thank you, Katie. Abraham?
I agree. I think that a little further, like on a person, like a character type of ordeal, when you take away somebody's votes, if they've been gone, in prison for about 7 years, they feel, I would imagine that they would feel less like a part of society. And that doesn't really seem like a good goal. The point is to help these people, come out of prison and reintegrate back into society, yet you're taking away something that is powerful. And I don't really think that that's quite fair, and that gets the true point across of the overall goal of getting people back into society. That transition seems less than what is appropriate.
Thank you.
Yeah, I believe when it comes to voters' rights and when it comes to felons and their right to vote, it's all about timing and the era that we're in. We were a nation that was developed on a social contract, so we are all in it together as one. When you give a little to get a little, but when it comes to this type of punishment, and you figure for the type of crimes that were committed by the individuals, where they served their time, they did their due, now they're going to re-enter back into society. Should they be able to vote again? Certain states vote for it, certain people are for it, certain people are against it. But you got to look at it in at a political aspect. Again, cost benefit analysis. You got to look at it as this: who is that vote going to count for? What constituents, are going to benefit? What party is going to benefit from, this individual who's formerly incarcerated? Now he gets his right to vote back. Who's it going to benefit? Which parties are going to benefit? Who's pushing the buttons here? Who's moving the envelope across the table? You have there are a lot of aspects that go into this. Do I believe that a person should have chances? Yes, he should have a second chance. I believe that once that person has served his time, he should be able to, exercise his rights once it's shown that, he's back and productive in society.
Thank you. Reverend?
Yeah, I agree with all of the panelists. This is a nation of laws, and when a criminal is remanded to custody and he serves his time, he ought to be credited with his time served. The whole act of disenfranchising an individual from what it means to be an American, that's a harsh penalty. And that's the penalty that, those who are incarcerated deal with. They are disenfranchised. The franchise means that you are free. When you are disenfranchised, that means that you are not free. And so part of what it means to be an American is that we participate in the voting process, the democratic process. And once an individual has, served his time, he or she, if they've served their time well and there are no issues, he or she should be admitted back to full franchisement within our system. And it has a bigger it has a bigger role than just voting. It also has a role in housing, education. You can't get a student loan. We have to make sure that we are helping people who made a mistake. We have to make sure that we are being fully human when it comes to this whole idea of crime and punishment, right? Because some people who still are in society, who commit corporate fraud, white-collar crime, they are not penalized like, those who create drug crimes. And so as we continue this discussion, we ought to think about all of the ways in which, the justice system just is not just or fair when it comes to crime and punishment. We punish certain people certain ways, and we punish other folks other ways. And to remove one's franchise rights from them in perpetuity is, I think, a cardinal sin.
Thank you.
So, quick question: is that due to because you have the category of crime, whether it be nonviolent or violent crime? Which one do you think is more punishable, more worthy, or more sustained to being judged more? Because a nonviolent crime such as drug dealing is considered a nonviolent crime because there is no real violence in a business transaction, if you want to call it.
But is it a felon?
But it's a felon. But it is a felony.
Okay.
But murder, manslaughter, crimes like that's an actual, commitment to you're causing substantial pain or death. But you can argue that you also are causing substantial pain or death if you sell drugs.
Right.
But I think the severity of the crime, this is where I'm getting at, that's where it comes into play. And that's where you have people that say, listen, we want to draw the line. Now, earlier on, Dr. Gerald, he spoke of, the types of punishment and the types of laws, how they were unbalanced and unfair. And then you spoke about the 1994 Crime Act, and you spoke about Michelle Alexander and her book, which is an excellent book. I suggest you all, try to pick that book up, And when it came to those certain laws, certain laws were written in a certain way, And when 1984 came into effect and the crack era really kicked off, they didn't know how to properly charge a lot of these young men who were out there, selling drugs and committing murders and committing crimes. So they had a bunch of laws on the books that were unassociated to narcotic crimes, that were unassociated to this. So, the federal government figured out a way, most of these laws were built on racketeering, organized crimes, and so on and so forth. So what they did in the case of Mr. Gerald's cousins and some of my family members as well, and people that I grew up with because I come from the South Bronx, these young men were out there doing what they did, doing what they were doing. So what did they do? What did they start to do? They started applying federal RICO statutes to these young men who, unbeknownst to them, once you name your organization, you are considered a criminal entity. That's right. And therefore...
but to your point, though, the question is, if you are labeled or found convicted of a felon, should you lose your right to vote forever?
That's a hard question.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Gerald?
Yeah, I think irrespective of the crime that we commit, right? If you've done your time, if you've been sentenced to do 15, 30, 35 years, and you've done that time, and you've done the work, you know, I'm grateful today to be a part of the state of New York and all of the wonderful things that's happening in terms of what's going on in the actual prison system with regard to mental health services. And what we're really finding out is that many of the young people who are incarcerated have severe trauma. And if these persons who have committed crimes have done their time, done the work that's a part of the rehabilitative process, and they're judged worthy of being released from prison, not because of overcrowding, but because they've actually done the work, I think we ought to, you know, be sensitive and admit them back into the full realm of society. I do believe that.
Thank you. That leads perfectly into the next topic, which is recidivism. Recidivism is one of the most fundamental concepts in criminal justice. It refers to a person's relapse into criminal behavior, often after the person receives sanctions or undergoes intervention for a previous crime. Recidivism is an important feature when considering the core criminal justice topics of incapacitation, specific deterrence, and rehabilitation. Incapacitation is simply about stopping them from committing or removing the offender from the community. Specific deterrence is the terminology used to denote whether a sanction actually stops somebody from committing further crime. Rehabilitation refers to the extent to which a program is implicated in the reduction of crime by repairing the individual in some way by addressing his or her needs or deficits. And I want to digress for a moment. I know we keep saying he, but use it as the universal he, she, or they. The Bureau of Justice Statistics studies have found high rate of recidivism among released prisoners. And these patterns of former prisoners were examined during a 9-year follow-up period. They found that out of 400,000 state prisoners released in 2005, an approximate 68% were arrested within 3 years, 79% within 6 years, and 83% within 9 years. However, 82% of that were arrested within the first 3 years. And then 47% of prisoners who did not have an arrest within 3 years were later arrested during 4 through 9. And yet, rehabilitation can work, as many of you have already stated. So the question to you is, what are your thoughts regarding efforts that can be used to reduce recidivism? Please, Dr.
So we know from the statistics and from the reports from scholars and other studies that have measured this phenomenon that those who tend to recidivate have not been given opportunities to grow. Psychologists will tell you that the cerebral cortex in most young people doesn't fully develop until around the age of 25. And so many people who are committing crimes in their late teens and early 20s don't have the full capacity of understanding what it is that they're engaged in, which is why some criminologists like Travis Hershey and Thomas Merton have talked about aging out of crime, right? Because crime if you look at Travis Hershey's broken windows theory, you know, folks tend to age out of crime at a certain, you know, point because they mature, right? And so many people who, from juveniles who develop long track records with the police, they become known by the police, and as a result, they tend to be, you know, dealt with swiftly by the arm of justice and sent to these prisons. The fact of the matter is that if you send a kid to a prison and you don't offer them any services, any education, any spirituality, any chance to, you know, deal with the traumas that they've grown up with, they're going to return back into society many times worse off than they came in, because the in prison culture, you come out not the same. You know, ask kids who've gone into Rikers, ask kids who've gone into Valhalla. You know, they go in, perhaps they're not really, you know, sold on the idea of being a criminal, but when they get into the prison system, they perfect how to become a criminal because they're hanging around career criminals, right? And so if you hang around anything long enough, chances are you're going to become it, right?
You
and
get
so
an education.
if
You get an education.
that's right. And so if either we're going to combat, you know, the likelihood of them becoming more criminogenic, or by instituting educational processes, mental health treatment, as well as other processes that they can really grow from, then when we release them back into the community, we ought to have a step down kind of proposition where they don't go right back home, but we give them sort of a safe space where they can land and we can further incubate them to become better and better suited for society. And so I believe that the onus is on the criminal justice system to provide all of the helps and needs that individuals will need to make it in this society.
Thank you. Abraham?
I couldn't agree more with everything you just said. So there's a program for juveniles called the Common Justice Program, and that does a great job giving an alternative for juveniles being incarcerated. So I have the pleasure of knowing someone who is working in that field right now, and they describe it to be, it's a house. So instead of going to a jail, they go to a house, and there are prison guards there. They don't have guns, and they are teaching these juveniles skills for life: how to cook, school, GED. They exercise every day. There's a program lifestyle, and I think that's a really important concept for helping them. They're young, and like you said earlier, you know, their brain isn't fully developed until 25, and most of them are experiencing some form of trauma, and that trauma is only going to get worse as they're in prison. One of my cousin's friends had passed away because he was profiled and got arrested, and when he came out, he committed suicide. So there's a lot of underlying issues that weren't addressed, and I think education is the big ball player when it comes to giving someone that opportunity. Most of the people who are coming from poor neighborhoods don't have that education, and so they're just diving deeper into that world. And like you said, it's the education of the jailhouse, how to be that perfect criminal. And it's not about the outside. Once they're in there, it's about what we're doing on the inside. So I think education is going to make the difference between someone relapsing. And I know we're going to get to AI, which I also think has a huge issue with incarcerating people with an implicit bias. But if we want to make a change, I do think education is where it has to start.
Thank you, Abraham. Katie?
I completely agree with both of your points. And to the Reverend's point in his introduction about how your cousin found his gifts after being released, I think that it's great that he did, and it would have even been better if we could try to work on these things within the prison system, because it really, the criminals often get blamed for receding or going back when research has shown that prisons are these breeding grounds for the type of education you're talking about how to be a career criminal. And this common justice program, Abraham was telling me a little bit about it yesterday and before that panel today. It sounds like a great way to set people up to succeed when they are released, and in a way that wouldn't even be called a release from this common justice program. It would be called, rehabilitation to society. And if we continually talk about how to find ways to rehabilitate these people that have made mistakes, rather than call it, committed crimes or are bad people, that we have to focus on starting from the inside rather than releasing people back into society, giving them freedom and expecting people to just, pull themselves up by their bootstraps and find ways to succeed on their own, which is just not as realistic as we'd like to say it is.
Thank you. Mr. Pope, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we live in an era where, things are constantly evolving. We live in an era where things are constantly changing, especially when it comes to pest sort of issues, sort of situations. You ever heard of the acronym PEST? Political, economical, socioeconomical, and technical. Some would call it. They will also add in legal. Those elements are constantly changing. So when you have an individual who's been incarcerated or been behind what they say behind a wall for a certain amount of time, they're going to come back into a world that they're unfamiliar with.
That's right.
And what we as a society, what we have to do is we have to become responsible within ourselves. We have to make ourselves accountable to these young people or these persons that are in these situations, to help them adjust, to reacclimate to what is going on today. I knew an individual. I grew up with a young man who was incarcerated since 1987. Wow. He just got out of jail in 2015 for a grave mistake that he made when he was 17 years old, over a drug argument. He got out in 2015. He had a family that was there waiting for him. Right now, 2019, 4 years later, he's a successful businessman in the city of Mount Vernon. You should go patronize his car wash right on Gramerton and Lincoln. It's called Ultimate Platinum. His name is Johnny Bunting. He's a hell of a story, a very success story. He's someone who had that support system when he came out. He had a family there to teach him how to use a computer, teach him how to use a cell phone, teach him how to swipe a Metro card. Because times change. Yeah. In 1987, when he went away, they were still tokens.
Yeah, that's right. Simple things.
In 1987, when he went away, there were no cell phones. It was barely the internet. But he's a gentleman, that, it comes down to the family within itself too, in the community. We are all one. And if we start thinking that again, like we're all one and being accountable for each other, we can make a difference.
Thank you. What that reminds me of, and I was just asking the Reverend, I'm sure most of us have seen the movie Shawshank Redemption. Morgan Freeman was the actor who portrayed the gentleman who was in jail for decades. And when he came out, life had changed so much, he just did not know how to acclimate.
Well, it's like throwing somebody in the deep end and saying swim and not giving any kind of, life preserver.
That's right.
So we're going to shift gears for a moment and go to a little more theological and talk about the cultural aspects of sin. Within our multicultural and multi-religious society, there are challenges regarding defining sin and/or morality. How do we strengthen social universalities and make peaceful progress toward a common good when individuals feel their sacred values are under attack? Who'd like to begin? It's a big one.
Well, so I guess I'm the only theologian here. So I'll take a stab at it. There's a good book, and I recommend it to this audience, called Sex, S-E-X, and the I World by Dale Keene. Anybody ever read that book? No? In that book, he talks about the fact that we left the traditional world, and that the ideal world is a relational world, but unfortunately we live in the I world, like iPhone, I world, and it's all about the individual. And in this I world, there are 3 governing taboos that we live by. Basically, mind your business, don't tell me what to do, and if I agree to do something and it's consensual, then it's all good. And I raise that as a jumping off point because I believe that we have to get to a relational dynamic where we are in relationship with each other. The studies have indicated that people have access to a device that when I was in 1985 it didn't exist. iPhone just didn't exist, right? You can be on Facebook, get email, you could send a text, you could receive a tweet, you can look at Instagram, all at the same time, right? And never before could you communicate like this, but yet people are lonelier now more than ever. People are disconnected from one another. Most people can't even hold a conversation with another person. We got to text it. I'm going to break up with my boyfriend, so I'm going to text it. Right? Mm-hmm. And so I think, we are beings, watch this, we're beings that when we are born, if we are not touched within the first 7 days of our life, we die from failure to thrive. We have to have the human touch. Theologically, we were created to be in community. Theologically, we were created to be our brothers and sisters' keeper. Theologically, we were created to care about each other. And theologically, Jesus Christ gave us a command to take care of the least of these, our brothers and sisters. Theologically, we're supposed to be connected.
Thank you. Now, for the others, you certainly can express your thoughts and opinions on how we can strengthen the social universalities and make peaceful progress toward a common good when we feel that or individuals feel that their sacred values are under attack. Any thoughts?
I think the simplest thing, it's not so simple at all anymore, is the first step is just to listen to other people. And I think, as the Reverend was talking about with the rise of iPhones and just it's an I world. And I think I, not just as in iPhones, but I as in me, as in I'm right, I have the best views. And I think there's a big difference between respecting someone and agreeing with someone. And I think that we are all constantly just talking over each other and not even respecting another person's views. Like Abraham and I could have, differing views on any number of, theological or political topics right now. But if I don't listen to him and hear what he has to say, how can I claim to be informed about anything? And when people say that their values are under attack, they don't even know what people are attacking, because when there's this, I think a lot of people know what confirmation bias is, when people only look for information that confirms what they already think or what they already know. And with this iGeneration, we have access to so much, we have access to a plethora of information, everything's at our fingertips, but we only look for the type of information that we want to know. So I think that being more open to other people's views, even if we don't necessarily have those same views, and I think this applies theologically, politically, even, scientifically, I think that can make people a lot more it could open people's eyes a bit and, make people even the slightest bit more receptive to views that they might not agree with.
Thank you, Katie.
I think that goes with civility as well, sort of that theme that's going on with Concordia right now, right? It would be civil of us to listen to each other and take into consideration, agree to disagree. But with this idea of the me, the I matter, if you don't give, you don't receive. And so you don't matter when the person you're talking to doesn't matter. So if you can learn to value them, then maybe they would learn to value you, and then it would be reciprocated. So it goes along relationships, it goes along with civility, and actually being interested in other people. And I think that's pretty hard to do right now, because like Katie mentioned, when you have the cell phone, you look up what you want to look up. If someone took your cell phone and put something on it, you may not like it, and then you would just close it out. That's sort of what many of us do in conversation, just blank stare and listen to them, and that's not what a relationship really is.
I think the we rather than the me, is like you were kind of getting to, is much more important than, since we are a community, like you were saying, I think putting the good of everybody rather than your own personal biases or your own, personal ways of looking at things.
Okay. Mr. Pope, did you have something? Because we are going to move to open forum and ask the audience for their questions. Would you like to express your thoughts on this?
One quick point, just,
Please.
I think all these concepts and points are coming into question how are we culturally competent. When we look at, our emotional intelligence, have you ever heard that term before, emotional intelligence, and how we connect? I remember looking at certain job applications years ago when I was applying for jobs, and they used to ask you, how are your interpersonal skills? Nowadays, they really don't ask you that. How are your interpersonal skills?
Because they know they're bad.
because most of the time you're filling out your application, it's online, and you're not filling out your application and handing it to a person. There's a difference. When you learn to when you have a job interview or something like that over the phone rather than in person, so that I is significant when it comes to this topic and how it relates to just general life.
Thank you so much. At this point, we'd like to turn over the mic to, or if you have questions, please, this is the time to share them. Okay, I see over here, is there a mic for this gentleman? Here we are. Right here, we'd like everybody to hear. Thank you.
So my one question, I've been here all day, but this was the one I was looking forward to.
Thank you.
My question being, you've heard of the Khalif Brower story?
Yes.
He used to go to my school, and one of my teachers used to teach him. And she appeared in the documentary film of the Khalif Brower story. And my question being is that I don't think Rikers Island is working. Why, as one NBA commenter said, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And the system, I feel like, if it's broke, why aren't they fixing it? Because you have so many people, who are in the system, and we still have to give money to the prison system. And then their excuse is, we don't have enough money for resources like mental health workers. There's a reason why they're doing the crime. They're not doing it just to, hey, I just want to kill someone. There's an exact reason, and it's in the brain, it's mental. Why isn't the system providing more mental health? They can throw people in the prison faster than they can blink, and we still have to pay for the prison system, so why not limit the number of people you put in prison and put more trained professionals in the prison system? So that means it's like the money financially for the city, it's like, let's pray for some more mental health services and less money for the prison systems.
So your question is?
So the question is, why aren't they putting more mental health services out there, and they're complaining so much more about the money that we don't have it? Like, why aren't they using the money for mental health services and keeping them out of the prison?
Okay.
So you're preventative
Thank you.
versus intervention.
Right.
Can I answer this
Ty?
question?
Yes, please do.
I think when you come, the Khalif Browder story, excellent point. Rikers Island is a place. Remember that. Rikers Island is a place, it's a location. It's the minds behind Rikers Island and the thought process that's the problem. When it comes to law enforcement, law enforcement tends to take on the mantra, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And they don't really look to evolve. I've been saying it for years as a rookie cop, as a young supervisor in the New York City Police Department, there's a better way to do things. But like anything else, they say, hey, you're a young man. Those are young thoughts. You're a little bit too progressive. You know, know your place. There'll come a day, there'll come a time. And we have to get out of that mind frame. We have to let new people come in with new thoughts and new ideas. And that's why I tell my students this all the time. And one of my students is here, a couple of my students are here, and they could tell you, I tell them this all the time. I love millennials. I love your freeness of thought. I love that you guys aren't afraid to express yourselves, to go out and say, listen, we don't have to listen to you guys. We'll do it our way, you know? But with that, you're going to always get, well, you did it your way, we're going to do it our way. And until, you know, the older generation who has the power comes into play, until they realize that, you know, we're going to have to come up with some sort of compromise or change.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Pope.
That's true. This whole thing's a big uh-oh.
The one of the things, to your point, you asked about why aren't they, and you know, the they is always nebulous, right? So really, the elephant in the room is, why aren't politicians more responsive to issues that we find problematic, right? Again, you know, we are leaving a patriarchal world, right? You know, patriarchy has dominated America since its founding. Now, the world is shifting rapidly, and it's shifting because, as the professor said, you young people are rising up. And the question becomes, what is going to be our governing philosophy going forward, right? We have to confront, you know, the fact that the deinstitutionalization movement, with the closing of mental health facilities across the nation, has exacerbated the criminalization of mental illness. And we are asking correction officers, police officers, to deal with mental health issues that we've not been trained for. And so the reality is that until America really deals with mental health as a real issue, we won't solve and we won't resolve the problems of the over-incarceration of the mentally ill, right? All of us have a mental health issue. You know, there's no one in this room that does not have a mental health issue. You may not have had a mental health crisis, but you have, we ought to take care of our mental health. All of us. And we don't like it. And I'm gonna tell you something, African American people are the worst.
True.
Because if you tell somebody that you go see a doctor for mental health, they're gonna say, I didn't know you were crazy. I'm not crazy. My car needs a checkup. I need a checkup. My children get checked. Why don't I get a checkup from the neck up? We all have mental health issues. And so the fact is that until our governing philosophy suggests that we take care of mental health needs and issues, it won't have a corresponding effect in the prison system, and it won't have a corresponding effect in our communities.
Trauma and fear affects us all.
Are there any other questions? Yes, all the way in the back. Thank you.
In May of 2019, there was a movie released on Netflix called When They See Us. I'm not sure if all of you on the panel have gotten an opportunity to watch that, but I just wanted to talk about that and like, what are your views on that and the exonerated five, being as though we are in...
Can you just give everyone context for that film?
Sure. The movie was about 5 African-American men that were falsely accused of rape in the mid-'70s. They were thrown in jail. They were not released. They were 13, 14, 15,
Okay.
16, around that age, they were thrown in jail and falsely accused, and they weren't released until maybe their 20s, early 20s. And then now the story came out, and now they are being looked at as the exonerated 5. So my question is, what are your views on that? Being as though we're in New York State, what are some of the things that you could take away from Crime and Punishment that can relate back to that as well?
Thank you.
Well, I lived that. That's my era. I knew some of those gentlemen. I knew H.E. Brathwaite, whose family helped exonerate the exonerated 5. His son is one of my best friends. We talk almost every day. I knew Yusuf Salam. I grew up in Harlem in the Bronx. I was 15, 16 years old when that time happened, and that label came down, you're a pack of wolf packs, you're wilding. Do I believe those kids did it? No, I didn't believe that those kids did it back then. Do I believe they were improperly represented? Yes, I believe they were improperly represented. I think they were scapegoated, and I kind of saw that when I was a member of New York City Police Department, the way the policies and procedures are set in place and set in motion for, when a person comes into, custody and what are they told? Their parents weren't afforded the certain opportunities to get fair legal treatment, to get fair legal counsel. Like my introduction to criminal justice society class could tell you, what does the Sixth Amendment allow you? The right to a speedy trial, the right to a fair counsel. Isn't that right, Nico? These are things that, we are afforded, and those gentlemen weren't accounted that. They weren't afforded that.
Thank
Dr.
you. Anyone
Gerald?
else on the panel?
Yeah, that was also my era, although I was a New Jersey trooper at the time. And when that decision, nobody believed that they did it. I was coaching football at Trenton High School. And I remember then First Lady Hillary Clinton being the one to refer to those young boys as a pack of wolves.
Super predators.
Yeah, super predators. That's what it was. And I can remember thinking, my God, this is awful. The problem is that, again, looking at the reality of policing, right? And understanding the reality of policing, what and how are police deployed and used? What is their role in a civil society, right? This is the question. And you have to understand that policing at some level becomes a religion. And most people don't understand it to this effect, right? And so the calling of society to keep society safe from super predators means that I don't care who you pin the rap on, somebody has to be arrested, right? And so my allegiance is given to the shield, to the badge, to the blue wall of silence. And I don't care how I extract any kind of victim statement or any kind of confession. If I got to coerce it, make it up, do whatever I have to do, I'm closing this case with an arrest. And in the world of policing, it's called cleared by arrest. And the only thing that matters is that we got a body for this case.
Perception.
So, until we really deal with the issue, every young brown, black person, whether they are female or male, will be suspected. And the issue becomes, even with AI, AI does not have an algorithm to figure out who you are as a black person. Whether you are me or Dr. Pope, we all look alike in the algorithm. So if I didn't commit the crime, but I got this skin, I might as well be the criminal. But the algorithms work for, dominant society. So until we really deal with the true nature of policing, we're not gonna make it safe for other Central Park 5s or Trenton, New Jersey 10s or whoever it is. We have to become more deeply human in our development, in our humanity, so that we can be more just in our dealings with one another.
You know what though, Doc? What we talked about the algorithm and technology, but what helped get the Central Park 5 exonerated was science.
That's right.
DNA.
That's right.
Common DNA. And in that, during the Central Park 5's trial, there was certain DNA evidence that basically acquitted them.
Yeah.
That basically showed that they were not there, but they showed that another gentleman was there.
That's right. Exactly right.
And that gentleman later admitted to being there.
That's right.
But yet, the police department or certain individuals within the police department and within the criminal justice system chose to withhold that,
That's right.
basically to satisfy, the masses, like you were saying before, to basically calm the masses and saying, listen, we got what we got, it's over, it's said and done, but yet these 5 kids' lives have forever changed.
Forever.
And forever will continue to be changed.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and the gentleman in the front would like to address.
For talking about crime, how can we predict crime? And you can't say every cop is good. You can't say that. You can't say that every cop is good. Where does it become the moment of the FBI coming into the federal investigation process?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I can tell you, and I'm sure Mr. Pope has the same experience. The FBI does not have jurisdiction in most locales, right? The FBI cannot infringe on New York City, New York State, New Jersey. It just can't come in. They have to be invited in. And most of the time, when you're talking about the FBI coming in to investigate, you're really talking about bias crime or crime that has been, given the distinction of having violated someone's civil rights, and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice coming in and reviewing the case. That has happened throughout policing with minimal effect. In New York, the most recent case is Eric Garner. The DOJ came in and they gave Daniel Pantaleo a clean, bill of, right, well, no big deal.
A pass.
The issue is that we have to pass, and you young people who you are changing the world, you have to get elected to office. You have to change the laws to make sure that people's civil rights, people's constitutional rights are protected, and that nobody gets a pass particularly in law enforcement. When I went into law enforcement, I'm sure when you went into law enforcement, you know what I was told? You cannot pull your weapon out of your holster unless you are staring down the barrel of a gun.
Wow.
It wasn't, it was a different era. Of course, everybody in America didn't have guns back then, but, you had a different threshold, and we were trained a little bit differently. We were trained to protect and serve the citizens of New Jersey primarily. And I think that goes the same with New York.
In New York, we give an oath, and it's called, and the first couple of lines of the oath it goes like this. It says, "In partnership to the community we pledge to." And that being held, part of the oath, it says, we hold ourselves to a higher standard because so much is expected of us.
That's right.
And not every person, is a good person within their heart.
Right.
And so you have to look at police officers in that sense, in your question, in that sense, you got to look at police officers as human beings too. We all have flaws. And, when I listened to your question, I saw multiple parts into your question. Mm-hmm. It can be a technical part to your question, and then it could be just basic, interpersonal part to your question. And your question being said, you asked the question of why does the federal government doesn't have a larger sense, a larger play in the politics of the states. That being said, you got to look at it like this. We are, what are we? The United States of America. Each state has its own laws.
Right.
We are guided by the federal jurisdiction, but each individual state has its own laws. Do you know that New York is one of maybe 8 states in the 50 states of the United States of America that does not have a racial profiling law on the books?
Wow.
You know, Texas has a racial profiling law on the books. Arizona has a racial profiling law on the books. Georgia has a racial profiling law on the books. New York State, the most progressive state in our country, besides California, California has a racial profiling law on the books.
Wow.
New York does not have one.
Well,
Well, thank you.
I think the distinction is that most people don't understand that New York City is not New York State, right? And when you leave New York City, you have just entered New Mississippi. No, I'm serious. New York is a very rural phenomenon.
Yeah, New York City is given a pass, basically,
Yeah.
when it
Right.
comes to New York State, because New York State really is the end to all when it comes to New York, in general.
Yeah.
But New York City itself is so massive.
Yeah.
We have so many millions of people that we command our own presence. So the 5 boroughs of New York, they're given a pass, an extension from New York State. But as you can see now, if you're looking and you're driving around New York now, and you drive around Westchester County and you're driving into New York, the highways, you see more and more presence of the New York State Police. That's why, that's because there was an internal rift between Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio, and he said, you know what, this is my state. New York State Police can come in at any time and take over New York City. But there's a mutual agreement between each other, and that's basically what it
At that
goes up
point,
to.
we do have to stop.
I'm sorry.
But the engagement has been phenomenal. We received so many other questions that we could be here for a few hours. But we had a really wonderful exchange of thought, and we appreciate your engagement. And please join me in thanking our panelists.